I am a brisk lad whose fortune is bad, and I am misfortunate poor, but indeed I intend my fortune to mend, and to build a house down on the moor, me brave boys, and to build a house down on the moor. Me brother does keep fat oxen and sheep in a neat little neck on the downs, and in the middle of the night, when the moon does shine bright, there's a great deal of work to be done, me brave boys. There's a great deal of work to be done. I'll walk all around on another man's ground, and take a fat sheep for me own, and with the aid of my knife I will end of its life. And it's then I will carry it home. Me children will hew the skin from the ewe, and I will be weathering on, and when the constables do come, I will stand with my gun, and I'll swear all I have is me own, me brave boys, and I'll swear all I have is me own.
Hello, my friends. Can you hear me now? Is it picking me up now? How's everybody doing tonight? How's everybody doing? 7 people watching. Can I get a single confirmation that you can hear me before I carry on, as always? So I think for some reason it just changed at the very start. It took the wrong microphone. It should be working now. Just want a confirmation. Hear you. Hello, hello. Okay. So, tonight, eventually we are going to finish this documentary on the French Wars of Religion, but as always, to begin with, I wanted to just share a few ideas. And I wanted to go back to and sort of expand a bit upon the idea that the Protestant Reformation in a lot of ways prefigured the modern transformation into the type of governance that Foucault called biopolitics and biopower. And I got into this a bit on the previous stream, but just to kind of sum up, it seems to me like Catholic feudal Europe was in many ways still a lot more similar to ancient, customary European society. In particular, the types of customary law and kinship-based society that Germanic Europe had prior to Christianization. A lot of these same elements were retained within Catholic Europe. And the Protestant Revolution or the Protestant Reformation, when that happened, I think it began the most profound shift in history from that pre-Christian Europe into the modern international order that we live under today. And I've got a bunch of, I did a long Q&A with ChatGPT, which I know ChatGPT is not a great source for any information, but speaking in generalities here, I found it interesting how ChatGPT was able to summarize a lot of the thoughts that I had already and sort of, in a lot of ways, confirm what I had already suspected. And so I did a Q&A with ChatGPT that I'm going to go through here with you guys. So what do I mean by Catholic Europe, feudal Europe, being more like ancient Germanic society than modern biopolitical society? Number one, the decentralization of power and governance. It says Germanic society was fundamentally decentralized, with power distributed among local leaders, clans, and tribes, rather than concentrated in a central authority. Governance often revolved around tribal chiefs or kings who wielded authority through personal loyalty and shared customs, and by extension of shared customs, shared ethnicity, than codified laws. Feudal Europe was also operating on a more decentralized system where authority was fragmented among local lords and vassals. The king's power was limited by his reliance on the loyalty and military support of feudal lords, much like the relationships between Germanic tribal leaders and their followers. Governance and justice were largely localized, with lords administering their own domains. Modern biopolitical society, which later on I will argue is more akin to Jewish customs and Jewish society and laws that came out of sort of Judaic thinking, is centralized and governed by a state apparatus, an impersonal state apparatus, that regulates populations through bureaucracies, institutions, and policies. Power operates on a macro scale, often bypassing personal ties in favor of anonymous institutional mechanisms. Personalized power relationships, we kind of covered that already. Justice and social order. Germanic society, justice was primarily communitarian and custom-based, enforced through assemblies like the Thing, a tribal council, and focused on reconciliation rather than punishment. I don't know if that's exactly true, but basically, law and order was enforced at the individual level in the Germanic society. People would, if they were wronged by another individual, they would be personally responsible to right the wrong, or they would have some advocate, some family member, or some close relation who would enforce the customs or laws and take revenge on whoever committed the wrong. Feudal Europe retained a sort of localized and customary approach to law and justice. In modern biopolitical society, justice and social order are maintained by state institutions, such as police, courts, prisons, which impose laws uniformly across the population. The focus shifts to discipline, normalization, and control of behavior through surveillance and bureaucratic regulation. And this is an important part here. The focus shifting to discipline, normalization, and control. And, over the past week since the last stream, I've thought more about the history of education, schooling, and prisons. And turns out consistent with my theory here, the institutions of prisons as the primary mode of punishment, and the institutions of schooling in terms of universal education, universally compulsory schooling for children, also began to emerge for the first time out of the Protestant Reformation. Number 4, social structure and hierarchies. Germanic society was structured around kinship groups and a hierarchy of warriors, freemen, and slaves. Social mobility was limited, and identity was closely tied to one's family and community and tribe, of course, ethnicity. Feudal Europe maintained similar rigid hierarchies with a division between nobles, clergy, and peasants. Social mobility was rare, determined by birth and inherited status, and the local communities, local tribes, and relationships, the ethnicity, remained the primary source of identity and support, much as they did in Germanic tribes. Whereas, that began to change drastically during the Protestant Reformation, because the Protestant Reformation coincided with a shift in power from these older power structures, these older hierarchies of feudal Europe, to the new mercantile class, the new moneyed class that was emerging at the time, which is why Protestantism also tended to emerge and tended to be strongest in those areas where the populations were most urbanized, most dominated by this new mercantile class, and most commercially driven. Okay, so that's kind of enough to give you where I'm coming from. And so, like I said just a couple seconds ago, I was thinking about universal education and the shift in the way that punishment was meted out in Europe at around that time of the Protestant Reformation. And so first I asked ChatGPT who were the early European advocates of universal education. And the number one on the list is John Amos Comenius, who here is called a Czech philosopher and educator who promoted universal education for all children. And, of course, John Amos Comenius was a Protestant. He's considered the father of modern education. And he was a bishop in the Unity of the Brethren, which was part of one of the oldest Protestant denominations of Christianity. Okay, so universal education emerged alongside the Protestant Reformation. And this, of course, like I said in the last stream, I don't want to have to keep repeating these ideas, but this, to me, represents a shift in the idea of the new elite class that was emerging at this time wanted discipline to be internalized within the population itself. It wanted the laws to be basically enforced at the individual level by the people themselves. They knew that the old purely sort of sovereign power, the old purely physical power that was being exerted on the population was not going to be enough to provide security, to provide cohesion, to create the conditions whereby these vast masses of people that were being essentially like cultivated in the urban centers could be governed. Like, they needed this new form of governance where these masses could, in some way, be programmed and brought into the fold of the agenda of the governing elite. And the only way to do that was through these sort of disciplinary institutions like schooling. Okay. So that was the first question I asked. Then I said, where and when were the first prisons of Europe established? And these exactly prisons in the way that we think about them now. I mean, they weren't like the primary method of punishment in these 12th to 13th century England and late 13th century Italy. It really wasn't the primary mode of punishment. That only began to occur in 16th century Europe. It says the rise of centralized states led to the development of more structured prisons, often integrated into fortress systems. And then it gave these examples. And I highly recommend reading Discipline and Punish by Michel Foucault, because he talks about this shift from the sovereign power of feudal Europe into the disciplinary power of pre-modern and modern Europe, and the sort of strategies that had changed and the reasons why this shift occurred. So it's interesting to see, coinciding with Protestantism is the development of more structured prison systems. I asked for more examples from the Renaissance. It gave one from England, one from France, and also it turns out the first ever professional police brigade or police department arose in the 1600s, 17th century Scotland, which we already know is or was a haven for Protestantism and crypto Jewry. And that to me is significant because police represents this abstraction of law and this removal of power from the individual men in that society and hands it over to the state. In like traditional, like I said earlier, in traditional Germanic or generally in European society, laws were enforced personally. If you were wronged, you were expected to get your own revenge. And the subjugation of the population by a foreign power, I think, requires the removal of this right from the average man. The right to revenge, the right to enforce laws at the individual level, the right to enforce morality at the individual level has to be stripped from the average man to subjugate, discipline, and control a population that is essentially foreign to the elites of that area. So that, I think, shows a significant step toward the modern world. I asked about Germany in particular, and it gave the example of Zuchthauser, correction houses, which by the late 16th century, so the late 1500s, were created in Germany as correctional institutions. And even this idea of a correctional institution signifies this shift as well, because in the customary society of pre-Christian Europe, I think that the average punishment for breaking a law or breaking some custom was not to correct the criminal's behavior. It was to exact revenge against the wrongs that were done to you personally. The average when some person killed somebody who wronged them, or let's say they cut off their hand, or whatever the punishment may have been, the goal was not to correct them or cure them of their criminality. It was to get your revenge. It was to, because get restitution, essentially, for the wrongs that were done to you. So this shift to the idea of correcting criminal behavior, curing criminal behavior, also represents, I think, this shift into the pre-modern mercantile society, where the elites saw the populations as being resources that they could utilize to their own benefit. And the elites, when the way that they look at criminality is not some kind of like personal affront to them, or some kind of personal damage to their body, they saw it more as like, I have a defective product. I have a defective, my property is defective and I want to fix it. And so that, I think, is an interesting shift as well. So then I asked about the first police forces, and of course it talks about Rome, talks a little bit about a certain police force that was sort of temporarily established in the 1200s by King Louis IX. But it was by the 17th century, the 1600s, right around the time of the Reformation, when it became a formal military-style police force. Here as well, in 1667, a centralized modern police force was established in Paris. I asked about Germany. I mean, there were electoral police in Germany at that time. Let's kind of skip over that. But here's an interesting part. Okay, so let's just sum up here. Okay. Someone said, I see that Germ there got himself a little head. Yes, it's Aristotle. It's my boy Aristotle, the father of scientific racism, according to the Washington Post. So this is, to take a step back and I think summarize it in a clearer way, because I know I'm all over the place here. I asked ChatGPT, analyze the Protestant Reformation in terms of Foucault's concept of biopolitics. Okay, so this will be sort of an executive summary. Analyzing the Protestant Reformation through Michel Foucault's concept of biopolitics involves exploring how the movement restructured power relations concerning the governance of life, bodies, and populations. Foucault's idea of biopolitics focuses on how modern states regulate populations and individual bodies to optimize productivity, morality, and social order. Here's how this framework applies to the Protestant Reformation. Number 1, decentralization of religious authority and biopolitical control. The Protestant Reformation, led by figures like Martin Luther, challenged centralized religious authority, the Catholic Church, and emphasized individual responsibility for salvation. This shift placed a greater emphasis on self-discipline and personal piety. Protestantism, particularly in Calvinism, promoted internalized moral regulation, aligning with Foucault's notion of power operating through self-governance rather than overt coercion. 2. Regulation of social and moral life. Protestant reformers sought to discipline social behaviors by connecting salvation with moral conduct. Practices like work ethic, sobriety, and frugality became central to the Protestant ethos, influencing the governance of both individuals and communities. This aligns with biopolitical strategies as religious leaders and emerging state powers sought to govern populations through moral and behavioral norms, shaping societal health and productivity. 3. Shift in power from the church to the state. The weakening of the Catholic Church's power allowed emerging nation states to take on regulatory roles traditionally held by religious institutions. This included control over marriage, education, and welfare systems, which became mechanisms of population management. For Foucault, this reflects biopolitical power, where states increasingly regulate life processes like birth, death, and family structure to ensure societal stability. 4. Disciplinary institutions and the body. Protestantism emphasized bodily discipline as a reflection of spiritual purity, promoting practices that governed physical behavior. For example, restrictions on feasting, dancing, or sexual activity. This can be seen as a precursor to modern disciplinary mechanisms. Calvinist communities, for example, created strict codes of conduct, embedding power into daily life, a hallmark of biopolitical control. 5. Population and economic productivity. The Protestant work ethic, as famously analyzed by Max Weber, linked salvation with industriousness, fostering a culture of economic productivity and population management. This reflects Foucault's insight that biopolitics often aligns with capitalist imperatives to optimize labor. In conclusion, the Protestant Reformation can be interpreted as a transformative moment in the history of biopolitics, as it redistributed mechanisms of power from centralized religious institutions to decentralized, internalized forms of governance. By reshaping individual conduct, social norms, and state policies, the Reformation played a significant role in the transition to modern biopolitical governance, where power operates through the regulation of life itself. So then I asked it about the rise of universal education, prisons as a common mode of punishment, and the creation of police forces and state surveillance of the population, which we kind of already went over. Okay. Of course, religious motivation to universal education was there. This idea of creating a disciplinary society of self-regulation and moral conformity in children, which the schools were instrumental in creating. Prisons also shifting in the philosophy of punishment from corporal punishment to this like moral reform, disciplinary approach. Police forces, we already talked about. State surveillance, of course. Says Protestant communities often employed forms of communal surveillance, such as mutual accountability within congregations. Everybody had to come to church. Church was compulsory in these areas where Protestantism was the dominant religion in the area. And it says it prefigured state surveillance by normalizing the idea of constant oversight for the sake of social order. And so Protestantism is a catalyst for modern governance of discipline, control, and governance that became hallmarks of the modern state. Its emphasis on individual responsibility, moral reform, social order influenced key institutions like education, prisons, policing, surveillance, making it a significant force in the emergence of biopolitical governance. These shifts reflect Foucault's analysis of power, moving from overt domination to more subtle, pervasive forms of control over populations and individuals. Okay, then, interesting part, this is where my theory, the rubber hits the road here. If this is true, if Protestantism it was instrumental in shifting society away from the feudal, customary, kinship-based, traditional mode of European law and order and just society as a whole, into the modern abstract, universalist, bureaucratic, impersonal, institution-based society that we have today. And I suspect that Protestantism was basically the first great emergence of crypto Jewry into the realm of power, into like the basically a multi-century coup d'etat where the crypto Jewish and often overtly Jewish mercantile class overthrew what was the last vestige of, or the last vestiges of traditional, customary European society. Then how does this apply to like traditional Jewish society? Can we analyze Jewish society, historically speaking, in terms of biopower and biopolitics? And ChatGPT gave an interesting answer. Number one, community autonomy and self-governance. Halakha, the Jewish law, as a biopolitical system. Jewish law, halakha, provides a comprehensive framework governing individual and communal life, from dietary rules to family relationships, health, and economics. This embodies Foucault's idea of biopower, as it regulates the body and population through norms and practices internalized by community members. Kahila structure. In medieval and early modern periods, Jewish communities often operated as semi-autonomous entities, kehilat, managing their own legal, educational, and welfare systems. These structures represented a form of localized biopolitics, where leadership regulated the community to maintain moral, social, and economic order. 2. Ritual practices and the body. Discipline of the body. Jewish rituals, for example, circumcision, dietary laws, Sabbath observance, are deeply concerned with regulating bodily practices. Think about just one example in the modern world is the vaccine schedule for children. These rituals can be understood as a form of biopower, structuring daily life and reinforcing communal identity through bodily discipline. Health and hygiene. Jewish law also addresses issues of health, sanitation, and purity. Mikvah practices, quarantine rules for illness. These regulations align with biopolitical concerns for managing life and ensuring the well-being of the population. Population management, reproductive regulation. Jewish law historically encouraged marriage and procreation, reflecting an awareness of the need to sustain let's skip this. Charity and welfare. Communal welfare systems served as biopolitical tools to manage the population, ensuring the survival of vulnerable members. Surveillance and moral discipline. Internal surveillance. Jewish communities employed forms of mutual accountability, where individuals' adherence to religious and moral norms was monitored within the framework of halakha, Jewish law. Rabbinic courts and communal leaders enforced compliance, reflecting Foucault's concept of power embedded in social relations. And everybody knows, I think, or at least a lot of people know, about the old like stereotype of the gossiping Jewish women. They're always like, they're worse than Protestants even in terms of constantly gossiping and picking on each other and finding fault, and Larry David is a great example of how that it's been turned into comedy with Larry David, of incessantly being focused on these tiny little social norms and social faux pas, and is this the right way to do this particular thing? Is this the right way to say this particular thing? I mean, they're like so insanely micromanagerial. So the whole like internal surveillance, internalized discipline is extremely strong within the Jew. Responses to external biopolitical pressures. Okay, that's not important. Diaspora and transnational biopolitics. Diasporic networks. The decentralized nature of the Jewish life in diaspora can also be understood biopolitically, as it relied on transnational networks to sustain populations, share knowledge, and regulate communal norms across different geographical areas. Okay. In conclusion, Jewish society exhibits rich examples of biopolitical and biopower mechanisms, from the regulation of individual bodies through ritual to the management of populations within semi-autonomous communities. These practices ensured communal survival, blah, blah, blah. Okay. Let me take a sip of this. Okay. Then I asked it about what preceded biopolitics. We already talked about that. Sovereign power. I lost. Now we're going to get into the good stuff, I think. I won't keep just reading word for word here because it's too much. But then I asked it what came first. We already talked about that. Then I asked it, under this framework, what type of power did pre-Christian Germanic society operate under? And of course, it talked about sovereign power, kinship-based power, communal power, which to me means, every individual is responsible within the community to enforce the laws and customs for themselves. Honor and reputation were central to that. Warrior ethos and military power. Okay. Sum up here. Sovereign power, communal, kin-based power. Then I said, compare that to historical Jewish society. We'll skip to the end here. In essence, while both societies had systems of authority that were deeply rooted in kinship and communal governance, Jewish society exhibited a more formalized system of law and religious discipline, while Germanic society was more focused on decentralized, honor-based governance and the direct exercise of sovereign power. Which one, I asked, prefigures modern biopolitics more? And of course, it answers historical Jewish society more closely prefigures the emergence of modern biopolitics. It was more concerned with abstract law and discipline, in terms of like a bureaucratic, codified legal system, the role of religion and governance, the community and surveillance. It says Germanic society, even though communal norms were important, they did not rely on the same level of surveillance or formal mechanisms for regulating individual actions. I mean, if laws enforced by the individual retaliating against those who wronged him, obviously you don't have to constantly surveil your neighbor if they're not wronging you in this kind of customary Germanic society. Whereas in Jewish society, where every aspect of life is in some way controlled under the legal system, everybody is constantly surveilling everybody else. So in conclusion, while both societies had their mechanisms for governing and regulating their populations, historical Jewish society more clearly prefigures modern biopolitics. Its comprehensive system of law and religious observance, which sought to regulate nearly every introduction to education and social behavior, shares many similarities with the techniques of modern states that aim to optimize life, manage populations, and control the body. In contrast, pre-Christian Germanic society was more focused on sovereignty, honor, and military strength, without the same level of formalized regulation over the population's health, behaviors, or reproduction that we see in biopolitics. And now, to take a quick tangent, one thing that I was kind of interested in was classical Greek society more akin to the Germanic or the Jewish societies that you just described? Because, I'm a fan of classical Greece, way more than the Roman Empire. I mean, classical Greece to me is like the height of history. It's when I look back fondly on like the golden age of European civilization, I think of Greece. I don't think of Rome. So I asked it about, was it more akin to this Germanic law, this Germanic form of law and governance, or the Jewish form of law and governance? And ChatGPT told me kind of what I was hoping to hear, which is, especially during the classical period, has characteristics that align more closely with pre-Christian Germanic society in some ways, while also exhibiting unique features that set it apart. But not Jewish law. It's more closely to pre-Christian Germanic society, they say. And the ways that is the case are, sovereign power and governance. They were organized into independent city-states, which had direct democracy, where every male citizen could participate in decision-making. So instead of having an impersonal bureaucracy that was enforcing some kind of abstract law, every adult male in the society was involved in decision-making, the exercise of power, the enforcement of law, essentially. Even though it's a little more abstract than like customary pre-Christian Germanic society, it still retains sort of the essence of this kinship-based communal law enforcement. Power was more distributed among citizens. Governance was often more participatory compared to the more centralized power in monarchies or theocratic systems. Sovereign power. In city-states like Sparta, power was more centralized in the hands of a small elite or military leaders. Spartan society, but this is kind of misleading because that's only because Spartan society was like the ethnos of Sparta ruled over sort of a mass of helots, of slaves. So they could say it's more centralized into a small elite, but that's only relative to the overall population, which was mostly helots. So within that elite structure, I think it still had these characteristics of a communal, kinship-based enforcement of law. So it says, comparison to Germanic and Jewish societies. Like Germanic tribes, Greek city-states had a decentralized structure where local leaders and assemblies played key roles in governance. The importance of military prowess, especially in Sparta, and honor, was central to maintaining power. Compared to Jewish society, it was more theocratic, intertwined with religious leadership. It's less similar to the Greek system. Blah blah blah. Kinship and communal power. I'll just skip over a lot of that. And compared to Germanic society, like the Germanic focus on clans and personal honor, Greek society, especially in Sparta, placed significant importance on the military unit and personal behavior, such as courage in battle. It says that Jewish society was kin-based, which is true within Jewish society, but we know how that evolves when they enter into other nations. Disciplinary power and the regulation of bodies. In classical Greek society, there was a bit more of that. There was a sense of education being advocated to cultivate the mind and body, to instill self-discipline and moral virtue. But education was not like this abstract disciplinary system that was instituted by the state. Education was seen as more of a kinship-based system of an elder cultivating a younger man. And it wasn't there to like discipline the population and bring them into some foreign agenda, or to subjugate them into the role that the state wants them to have. It was more of like a true, genuine education that was meant to improve the mind and body of the young man. So way more kinship-based, I think, than the abstract, bureaucratic, disciplinary system that we see in the biopolitical system. So the religious and secular power, kind of skip over that. Community and surveillance. Says the sort of participation in politics and public life, while in Germanic society, surveillance was tied to kinship and personal honor. Greek public life was much more institutionalized, with an emphasis on citizenship and legal responsibilities. So in some way, it's like a more abstract and institutionally developed society than Germanic society, but as it says here in the conclusion, it still has a lot more, in essence, in common with the sort of pre-Christian Germanic society than a biopolitical Jewish institutional society. Then I asked it, and this is the last thing that I don't want to do ChatGPT the entire stream, but this to me was the most interesting part. Then I asked it, what mode of society, hypothetically speaking, ChatGPT, what mode of society, the Jewish or the Germanic, would be more effective for an imperial power that wished to control diverse population groups? And of course, I got the answer I expected. An imperial power seeking to control diverse population groups would likely find Jewish society's mode of governance, with its focus on law in the abstract, religion, and communal cohesion, more effective than Germanic society's focus on decentralized kinship and militarism. Here's why. Okay, so this Jewish society creates a comprehensive and universal law system and a unifying framework that could regulate diverse groups, allowing for a degree of cohesion within a broader empire. Whereas Germanic society operates on this decentralized, honor-based, kinship-based system where individual reputation is important and individual enforcement of law is important. Okay, it was far less formalized and relied more on personal allegiances and collective decisions of the tribe, all the men of the tribe getting together in something like the thing, some kind of assembly, which might work in a more homogeneous society, but it would be less effective for managing and unifying a heterogeneous or diverse empire. Religious authority and imperial control. Okay, I've talked about this in the past. The monotheism of Jewish society, this universal God, is obviously more. It lends itself more to an imperial existence, an imperial governance, whereas the Germanic society is more based on, obviously the gods of that people. Centralized governance versus decentralized tribalism. Of course, Jewish society is more emphasis on a uniform law system, centralized bureaucratic oversight, whereas Germanic society is obviously decentralized. We're kind of repeating ourselves at this point. Cultural cohesion versus military cohesion. I don't think that this is exactly accurate, but tribal loyalty is the one thing in this paragraph that's important. Obviously, that the cohesion of the unit is based on shared ethnicity, shared ancestry, whereas the cohesion of the Jewish society is more along the lines of following this abstract and legal and religious system that is meant to be universally applied. So then we have surveillance and control. The surveillance systems in Jewish society are, more effective tools for monitoring behavior across the whole population. And imperial power could employ similar mechanisms of internal surveillance and collective responsibility to ensure that subject populations adhered to imperial laws and policies. Germanic society lacked the same systematic internal surveillance. Okay. In conclusion, Jewish society offers a more effective model compared to Germanic society. Okay. Then, the next few questions we've already kind of answered. Obviously, Germanic law is more suited for a smaller, ethnically homogenous nation, whereas, the whole outlook of Judaism is more suited to a diverse imperial state. Why Jewish law fits better for empire. Then I asked about Roman society, and it actually said, interestingly, it has characteristics from both Germanic and Jewish societies, and that it was unique in a lot of ways. So I won't go down that rabbit hole right now. I don't really know what to think about Rome. I think early Rome might have been based and authentically European, but once they start getting into the later Roman period, obviously it was more akin to Jewish society, which actually I asked, could that explain why Rome was more amenable to Christianization? I can't imagine classical Athens or classical Sparta ever getting Christianized, but Rome said yes, the Roman Empire's structure was, it made it amenable to Christianization. But I think, once again, that was more toward the later period of the empire. And I can't really put my finger on, obviously, Emperor Constantine's conversion was a big moment, but there was also like the Severan dynasty that were Phoenician, and the Phoenicians are closely related to the Jews. The Severans ruled before Constantine, but it's hard to put my finger on the moment when Rome became corrupted. But so I asked about Rome, and then I asked about how Catholic feudal Europe was more like ancient Germanic society, which we already talked about, and now we're at the end. So that was my Q&A with ChatGPT, which I thought it was interesting. Once again, take everything from ChatGPT with a grain of salt, but it's interesting to sort of converse with it in this way, because it does have the ability to draw from a large number of sources. It has the ability to accurately represent ideas in general. And, it's for somebody like me who doesn't have as much free time as I'd like to have. I think it's a useful tool in organizing thoughts and some sort of generalized support for certain lines of argumentation. And I was happy to see that it agreed with the big ideas that I had, which were essentially, Jewish society in many ways prefigured modern biopolitics. The Protestant Reformation was a major moment of transformation into the modern biopolitical mode of governance, and that ancient Germanic society was essentially and fundamentally different from this type of state that we're living under now. All these things I'm sure you guys know already, but it was just an interesting sort of presentation of these ideas, in my opinion. And it obviously, like, these are the big ideas that I'm interested in when I'm looking at something like the French Wars of Religion, and I'm wondering, who were these people that were responsible for leading this revolution during the Protestant Reformation, and who were responsible for this massive shift from the sort of feudal agrarian way of life in medieval Europe to the industrialized, urbanized, and biopolitically controlled surveillance state that we live under now. And, obviously I think that it was a battle between, essentially a battle between two rival ethnic elites. And that, I'm always interested in trying to find the earliest point in history where I could, point and say, this was the moment, or this was at least a crucial step toward the current system we're living under today. And to me, the more I look at it, the more I think about it, the more it seems that the Protestant Reformation was that at least one of the biggest steps forward toward the creation of the modern society that we're living under today, the modern, Judaically dominated society that we live under today. So let me go to the chat because I've just been ignoring you guys. No Coiner, what's up? Long time no see. He says, defeat of the Gaelic lords after the war, leading Irish lords like Hugh O'Neill and Hugh 1607, leaving Ulster without its traditional leadership. Yeah, we talked about that. We talked about the Ulster plantation a couple streams ago, and speculated with support from a paper that I found that, also dug into the genealogies and genetics of Ulster Scots, that the Ulster plantation was basically a crypto-Jewish operation. So it's interesting you bring that up now. I don't know if you saw that stream, but JB Presenta, how you doing? Modernism and progress are Jewish, coming right out of Gnosticism, as Eric Fogelin points out. Absolutely. Inventor, earlier he said, I was born in a Catholic family. I think that's what he means. I feel like this was amazing since it was inherently traditional here in Central Europe. My parents were basically teaching me against communism, sodomites, and so on. Yeah, out of all of the Christian groups out there that I know of, I've only ever met the only Christians that I've ever met that were against communism and who were in some ways woke to the JQ and, just overall based, were Catholics. And obviously I'm not a fan of Christianity as a whole. And I think actually that the Christianization of Europe, was necessary for creating a Protestant Reformation in the first place. But, out of all the Christian groups, it seems like Catholicism is definitely the one that is most aligned with native European sensibilities and ways of life. So, yeah, that is my long introduction. Let's see, how long have I been going for here? Almost an hour. So now for the second hour, let's finish off this documentary on the French Wars of Religion. At this point, we saw the last big event we saw was the Bartholomew's Day massacre, which, who knows? That could have just been a psyop. Who knows if they really massacred all those people? It would have been easy back in that time to, if even just a handful or a dozen people were killed, for the Protestant rabble-rousers to send their messengers to the other cities and say, "Oy vey, it was a Holocaust. They killed 3,000 of us," something like that, to really get people riled up. So that was the last major event we saw. After that came the Fourth War, the Fifth War, the Malcontents, and we're about to start on the Sixth War. So let's get back to the documentary. I bet it's going to give us an ad before it starts. Oh,
it's 1576.
Surprising.
France is at peace after the Edict of Beaulieu, but the country is more divided than ever. Catholics are outraged at the unprecedented concessions granted to the Protestants. Many have lost faith in their king, whom they view as a weakling, unable or unwilling to defend them. The last straw, as they see it, is the granting of the governorship of Picardy to Condé. This is obviously a Huguenot plot to link up with the Calvinist Dutch rebels. Therefore, it must be stopped at all costs. To this end, the Catholics set up a powerful regional league to defend themselves from Protestant encroachment. Seemingly overnight, a series of similar Catholic leagues are formed all over the east, north, and center of the country. The king at first is taken by surprise, but then quickly decides to preempt trouble by seizing the initiative. For this reason, Henry organizes an Estache Generale at Blois.
I hate to pause this early, but I wonder, let's see what ChatGPT thinks about this. Was there any relationship between Protestant leagues during the Wars of Religion and Freemasonry? Let's see. Let me make this bigger. Only got 26 viewers right now. I don't know why there's usually I'm up at 60. Maybe some people were saying notifications weren't coming through, or maybe some people are just sick of this topic. But this will be the last stream that I have on this particular topic. Why does it have to type this way? Can't it just pop everything up here? So, conclusion, just the overview here is there's no direct historical link, apparently. I bet I could find one, but ChatGPT finds, no direct historical link, but there's shared emphasis on reform. Networks of solidarity and opposition to centralized authority suggests certain ideological and structural continuities The intellectual and cultural environment created by the Protestant Reformation, including esoteric traditions and a challenge to orthodoxy, helped lay the groundwork for movements like Freemasonry, which emerged in a later era with broader and more universalist aims. So the main points were historical context, reformist goals, social, intellectual, and moral reform. So, just another apparatus of biopolitics. Religious pluralism promoted religious tolerance, reflecting a shift away from the rigid confessional divides of the wars of religions. Were explicitly religious and confessional, their existence represented a challenge to the idea of a single religious orthodoxy, a principle that Freemasonry would expand upon in a broader, more universalist context. Organizational structures. Protestant alliances relied on international networks of support, often crossing borders to align with other Protestant rulers, nobles, and communities. This transnational cooperation foreshadowed the cosmopolitan nature of Freemasonry, which also established international lodges and cultivated cross-border solidarity. Protestant thinkers were drawn to esoteric traditions, including alchemy, Rosicrucianism, and Hermeticism. Yeah, Rosicrucianism was definitely a precursor to Freemasonry. And Rosicrucianism was, of course, a Protestant. Okay, so just an idea that I had there. Nothing like groundbreaking or conclusive there, but something to think about.
But almost all the delegates who arrive are Catholic. Initially, the king proposes reforms. However, all the delegates want to hear about is war. Therefore, Henry changes his tone and confesses that he himself would like to attain better terms. But war is a costly matter, and he will need money. At this point, the estate lets him down, offering only a paltry sum for the war. When the offensive starts in 1577, Henry has barely enough money for 4 months. Consequently, after a few minor sieges, the offensive staggers to a halt. Unable to take action, the king is forced to make peace with the Huguenots. The Peace of Bergerac is signed in September 1577, ushering in 7 years that will be almost free of war. But the absence of major actions does not mean an end to hostilities. Small-scale war is now endemic in France. Bands of soldiers in the hire of particular lords roam the countryside, ambushing and skirmishing with opposing bands, laying waste to the meager belongings of the commoners left and right. Violent peasant revolts break out in the affected regions.
Foucault kind of talks about this, how during this time, vagabondism was a major problem in Europe, where these gangs of retired or what's the word for a soldier that abandons their company? These retired soldiers would roam around and basically harass the average people for money or food, and that in and of itself makes me wonder how much of that was encouraged, how much of that was like secretly funded or encouraged by lords who were intending on it causing like a problem reaction, where things are so bad, things are so there's so much trouble for the average person that they'll come running to the Lord begging for them to establish a police force or lines. This is all talking about later on, like the 1800s, but yeah, I wonder about that too.
with the peasants themselves forming war bands to attack the nobility. War, pestilence, and failed harvests bring France to its lowest point. Unperturbed by this, Alençon, who has since been promoted to Duke of Anjou, is still on a quest for personal glory. Eager to prove himself, he organizes a small force and proceeds to invade the Low Countries. Once there, the Dutch rebels promise him everything, including the crown, the only condition being that he himself has to remove.
Deserter. Yes, that's the right word.
But Anjou is penniless, and he can't count on support from Henry or Catherine, who've been opposed to this project from the start. Undaunted, Anjou goes to England and proposes to Elizabeth I. But Elizabeth, who has dealt with much bigger men than Anjou, rejects him after a brief lead-up. Dejected and disabused, Anjou returns to France a broken man. Meanwhile, France reaches the boiling point once more. The seventh and shortest war breaks out in November 1579. The cause is the same as in the previous war. Condé tries to claim the governorship of Picardy, and the Catholics go out of their way to prevent this. Hostilities also break out in the south, but the war peters out after a few minor sieges. Most Protestants don't want a war, and will be content with the reaffirmation of their rights. Henry obliges, and guarantees those rights provided by the Edict of Beaulieu. Unsurprisingly, the Catholics are greatly displeased by this. The casual violence of a peaceful period simmers on for 4 more years, before things finally come to a head. Anjou dies on June the 10th, 1584. This means that unless Henry III produces an heir, the throne will fall to Henry of Navarre. Since the king is not interested in women, and longevity is also not on his side, a Calvinist king is almost a certainty now. Henry III tries to compromise by inviting Henry of Navarre to adopt Catholicism. When Navarre refuses, Henry of Guise feels compelled to act. Thus commences the longest and bloodiest episode of the conflict, the War of the Three Henrys. Catholic leagues all over France agree to unite under the leadership of the Guise. Realizing that it's now or never, Spain offers its full support. On the last day of 1584, in great secrecy, the Treaty of Joinville is signed between the Catholic League and Spain. The League promises to recognize the elderly Cardinal of Bourbon, Navarre's uncle, as the rightful heir to the throne. Additionally, the Guise promise to adopt the findings of the Council of Trent into law, and also to end France's alliance with the Ottomans. In return, Spain offers full financial and military support. Immediately, the League springs into action. Their forces suddenly seize control in the north, the east, and the center of the country. The king's first reaction is to declare war, but he's dissuaded by Catherine, who advocates for negotiations instead. While the talks are going on, the Guise take steps to consolidate their power. In March 1585, they publish the Manifesto of
No Coiner saying, you guys know that the Jews aren't actually the dominant ruling class, right? I've studied the demographics of the elite. Senators are 2/3 British Isles ancestry. National banking is 80% Protestant, 15% Catholic, 5% Jewish. Wall Street is 1/3 each. Nobody would ever claim that everyone in the ruling, or at least the elite level of the managerial class, is Jewish. That's not really what who says that, who talks about the JQ means. That's, nobody would claim that. But what we're claiming, or at least what I claim, is that the entire project of globalism and the means and mechanisms of the current globalist system have an ideological root in Judaism. And also that, the upper echelons, even if it's only even if it's true that it's only 5% or whatever in national banking, the upper echelons, I think, are controlled by a small percentage of even that managerial elite. And that, going back to even the Rothschilds, international banking as a whole has been controlled at the highest level by Jewish international bankers for hundreds of years. And that even if, like you said, the sort of visible managerial elite is not majority Jewish, the power is still, going back hundreds of years, dominated by small groups of Jewish internationalists like the Rothschilds, and that they exert a disproportionate amount of power internationally. And the third thing I would say is that, you said 80% are Protestants, but I suspect that a lot of Protestants are actually crypto Jews or like converted Jews who decided to assimilate into Christian society hundreds of years ago. So, there's a few things that I would say about that, but essentially to me, the biggest element is the ideological continuity that something like Protestantism represents, which has its foundations in this monotheistic world empire that is meant to fix the world, cure people of their backwards customs and heritage, and unite everyone under one universal system. And that ideology in Europe traces its roots back to Judaism and all of the like esoteric emanations that came out of that spiritual tradition.
Peron. In the manifesto, they outline the grim future that would await Catholics if the state became Protestant. If nothing is done, atrocities will surely follow. Additionally, they recommend that the Estates Generales should meet 3 times a year, that taxes should be lowered, and that parallel to this, the war should be renewed. This appeal garners them even more support. Countless towns and cities side with the League, since they see it as the last chance to stop the Huguenot fanatics. Most notably, Paris sides with the League. While still nominally under the control of the king, in private most of the city and its officials have already sided with the Guise. A secretive organization of Catholic zealots, the Committee of the 16, named after the 16 districts of Paris, is set up around this time. The 16 infiltrate every major organization of the city, poised to take on the king whenever the opportunity should arise. Faced with these impossible odds, Henry III is forced to concede. In July 1585,
Hold on, I need to go back here. What is this League of the 16?
their power. In March 1585, they published the Manifesto of Peron, and also to end France's alliance with the Ottomans. In return, Spain offers full financial and military support. Immediately, the League springs into action. Their forces suddenly seize control in the north, the east, and the center of the country. The king's first reaction is to declare war, but he's dissuaded by Catherine, who advocates for negotiations instead. While the talks are going on, the Guise take steps to consolidate their power. In March 1585, they publish the Manifesto of Peron. In the manifesto, they outline the grim future that would await Catholics if the state became Protestant. If nothing is done, atrocities will surely follow. Additionally, they recommend that the Estates Generales should meet 3 times a year, that taxes should be lowered, and that parallel to this, the war should be renewed. This appeal garners them even more support. Countless towns and cities side with the League, since they see it as the last chance to stop the Huguenot fanatics. Most notably, Paris sides with the League. While still nominally under the control of the king, in private most of the city and its officials have already sided with the Guise. A secretive organization of Catholic zealots, the Committee of the 16, named after the 16 districts of Paris, is set up around this time. The 16 infiltrate every major organization of the city, poised to take on the king whenever the opportunity should arise. Faced with these impossible odds, Henry III is forced to concede. In July 1585, the Treaty of Namur is concluded between the king and the League. The document strips Protestants of all rights and privileges granted to them since the start of the war. It also lays down strict laws against heresy to be enforced by the League and paid for by the king. Furthermore, the Catholics too would receive a number of security towns where they could maintain a permanent army. Thus humiliated, Henry withdraws for a time, leaving political matters to his mother and the war to the League. Bolstered by Spanish silver, the Catholic League goes on the offensive in 1586. Small-scale sieges and skirmishes make up the initial actions. Henry of Navarre and the Protestants are taken by surprise and adopt a defensive position. They ask for help from the usual places: Queen Elizabeth and their longtime backers in Germany, Frederick III, Elector Palatine, and his son John Casimir. By 1587, a large army of Germans and Swiss is being raised in the Palatinate from money supplied by the English. Faced with foreign intervention, the king determines to take to the field. He puts together a large force and stations it in the Loire Valley. As his first move, Henry sends a sizable advance guard led by one of his favourites, the Duke of Joyeuse, to engage the dwindling forces of Navarre. Navarre plans to sally from La Rochelle and move south where he can gather more men and await the arrival of the Germans. Joyeuse is determined to intercept him. He achieves this on the 20th of October 1587. Unable to retreat, Navarre offers him battle near the village of Coutras. The two forces are almost evenly matched, with Navarre having 4,000 infantry and 1,500 cavalry, while Joyeuse commands 5,000 infantry and 1,800 cavalry. Navarre anchors his left flank on the village and his right flank on a forested area. He arranges his cavalry in the center and his infantry on the flanks. However, he also positions small groups of musketeers among his cavalry, whom he orders to fire only when the enemy is a few paces away. Additionally to tactical innovations, Navarre also implemented technological changes. His gendarmes no longer charge with a lance, instead they use a pair of pistols. This offers them an advantage in the countercharge, since they can now inflict damage first on those who charge them, then attack the stunned enemy with swords. Joyeuse falls into this trap with gusto. After a brief artillery bombardment that mostly affects the Catholics, Joyeuse orders his left flank to engage the Huguenot right. His cavalry charges its opposing number and achieves limited success. Meanwhile, his infantry engages the Protestant foot. The Huguenots stand firm and repulse this initial attack. Next, Joyeuse orders all his cavalry to charge. By the time they reach the Protestant lines, they become disorganized. They are met with devastating fire that in an instant decimates them and puts them to flight. Now the Protestants charge in with swords, cutting down anyone who isn't fast enough. In the end, 2,000 Catholics, including the commander himself, lie dead on the battlefield. The Protestants suffer minimal casualties. After obtaining this stunning victory, instead of mounting a pursuit, Navarre unremarkably decides to stay put and wait for the Germans. Indeed, the Germans were mobilizing throughout the summer of 1587. John Casimir decides to give the command to Fabian von Dohna. According to Navarre's orders, Dohna is to march straight to the Huguenot south to join up with him as soon as possible. But instead, Dohna makes an extended stop in Lorraine, pondering whether he should loot the duchy or not. After this, he marches his force due northwest towards Paris. While the king remains stationary with the main force, Henry of Guise is sent with a scant force to stop the 7,000 Germans, 12,000 Swiss, and 2,000 French in the expedition. Remarkably, he manages to do this. On the 26th of October 1587, he falls on the German camp and it doesn't achieve much, but it does demoralize an already confused enemy. Soon enough, the Swiss are paid off, leaving the Germans to stand alone. Nonetheless, Dona pushes on all the way to the town of Ono. He settles into the town and begins to plan his next move. Unbeknownst to him,
The town of oh no.
Henry of Guise hid musketeers within the town, while he himself lays in ambush outside the walls. On the 24th of November, as Dona prepares to leave the town, Guise pounces on him. The Germans are routed and barely manage to regroup. Seeing that the Duke of Guise is just days away from an absolute victory, the king decides to intervene. He bribes the Germans to leave, promising them safe passage, hoping that this way he can minimize Guise's contribution. Having dealt with this problem, Henry III returns to Paris. But as the news of Guise's stunning victory and the pitiful defeat of his favourite reaches the city, Henry discovers that his popularity among Parisians is close to zero. Worst of all, the Duke of Guise demands the governorship of Normandy in return for his services. Henry III deems this excessive, as he considers the Guise already powerful enough. To stave off trouble, the king banishes the Duke from Paris. Little does he know that a terrific plot is already being hatched against him.
Seems like a bad idea to send away your biggest advocate, your biggest general.
It's 1588. Tensions are high. Paris is like a hornet's nest after the recent developments. Henry of Guise demands the governorship of Normandy as a reward for serving his country, but the king cannot allow the Guise to gain even more power. Therefore, the request is denied. Even worse, the Duke is banished from the capital, and the governorship is given to the king's other lackey, the Duke of Epernon. This is an affront Henry of Guise cannot accept. In May 1588, he enters Paris anyway, followed by a large retinue. The city's gates are thrown open, and Guise is welcomed by cheering crowds. By now, the capital is de facto under the control of the Committee of the 16. The militia is on their side, and the king's orders are being openly defied. Catherine of Medici feels compelled to cozy up to the League. However, Henry III is already planning his countermove. On the 11th of May, the king orders several battalions of Swiss into the capital. This is a big mistake. Having foreign troops in Paris is something unheard of. Instigated by the 16, the Parisian mob begins to erect barricades. The Swiss try to restore order, but the militiamen overwhelm them by sheer numbers. Guise considers the situation and decides to offer the king a way out. On May 13th, the Swiss are allowed to leave, followed by Henry III shortly after. Now, the Guise are at the height of their power. The League rules the better part of the country, and the 16 officially take charge in Paris. More pressure is put on the king to obtain further concessions. In July 1588, Henry is forced to sign the Edict of Union, a radical document promising the extermination of Protestantism. The king also pledges to dismiss Epernon and give Normandy to the Guise. Most importantly, he agrees to name the Cardinal of Bourbon as his heir. The League's coup is carefully timed to coincide with another major move.
Damn, look at the graphics there. Amazing CGI.
Deployment of the Spanish Armada. In July, more than 100 Spanish vessels form an impenetrable wall of wood stretching for miles in the English Channel. They are tasked with picking up the Duke of Parma and a large army of veterans who are intended to invade England. With his flank secured by the Catholic League, Philip II believes he can pull this off. But the English are led by the most skillful sailors of the day, John Hawkins and Francis Drake. The English take advantage of the winds and use an age-old tactic against the Spanish: fire ships. With this ploy, the Armada is scattered and forced to sail around the British Isles. Parma has to stay put, and the invasion of England is called off. Protestants all across Europe rejoice. Henry III also gains courage and decides to reclaim the initiative. First, he tries to subvert the League at the Estates Generales. But to his dismay, he finds out that most of the delegates are supporters of the League. Undaunted, the king determines that harsher measures are needed. The Guise have to be taken care of St. Bartholomew style.
See, why is he going against his own general that hard? You know, why? If they're in a position to win, if they can actually win and restore like the Catholic monarchy, why is he subverting his own cause?
On the 23rd of December, 1588, as soon as he enters the king's chambers, Henry of Guise is stabbed to death. The similarities between this and the fate that befell Coligny 16 years earlier are not lost to the Leaguers. The areas controlled by Catholics explode with rage. Henry of Guise had been their saviour, the last chance to maintain the country's integrity. Now that he's gone, Henry's brother, the Duke of Mayenne, is put in overall charge, and the Catholics become even more radical. The king is chased out of his realm, and only controls a few towns in the Loire Valley. Catherine of Medici dies in January, leaving him even more exposed. He is out of options now. He cannot let the Guise get away. However, being powerless himself, he will need allies to reclaim his country. Henry III has no other choice but to make a pact with Henry of Navarre. The Treaty of Plessis-les-Tours is signed in April 1589. The king and the...
What does he mean he has no other choice? He could just join the Catholics like the king was at the start of this war. The king was on the Catholic side at the start of this war. We've gone through multiple kings at this point, but the monarchy seemed to be aligned with the Catholics to begin with. Why is he switching sides at this point?
The Protestants join their forces and strike at the heart of the League, Paris. Paris is too large to be taken by storm, so the Allies surround the city in order to starve it out. Catholics within the city become even more radical. Moderates and royalists are purged. Henry III is declared the devil incarnate. Those who were loyal subjects of the crown just 10 years ago are now fierce republicans. Many preachers call for the death of the king. One man among the crowd, a Dominican friar, decides to take things into his own hands. On August 1st, 1589, claiming that he is a deserter carrying important messages, the friar mortally stabs the king. As Henry III lays dying, he names Navarre as his successor and urges him to convert to Catholicism for the sake of the nation. Navarre refuses this for now.
Yeah, right. Urges him to convert to Catholicism. Why? He could have just sided with the Catholics from the start. Why would he urge Navarre to convert to Catholicism unless it was purely like a Machiavellian choice, like him saying, look, obviously this plan to turn the nation Protestant isn't working. The people are against us. You're going to have to like make concessions. You're going to have to become a crypto, basically. Or else they know too much already. They're against this whole Reformation thing. So you're going to have to be more sneaky and subtle about it. That's what it seems like to me.
In response, the Leaguers concoct elaborate theories to confirm the Cardinal of Bourbon's primacy to the throne. The siege of Paris continues, but as the weeks go by, more and more men desert from Navarre. He has to lift the siege eventually, and begins his retreat to Normandy. Navarre marches to Dieppe, where he hopes to receive reinforcements from England. Seeing that Navarre is on the back foot, Mayenne sallies from Paris with a large force. He follows Navarre all the way to Dieppe. He needs to capture the town before English reinforcements can arrive. However, to do this, he has to cross a marshy river at the small village of Arques. Navarre is already prepared, laying out his forces in 2 trenches that block the only crossing. He barely has 5,000 soldiers compared to Mayenne's 24,000. This overwhelming superiority in numbers makes Mayenne overconfident. He walks into Navarre's trap with full conviction. On the 21st of September 1589, as a dense fog settles over the battlefield, Mayenne makes his first move. He sends forth a battalion of Germans who pretend to be deserters. The men in the first trench take the bait. The Germans suddenly turn on them, as Mayenne himself launches a cavalry assault. The League's forces manage to overwhelm the first trench. However, when they get to the second trench, they are welcomed with murderous fire. The fog suddenly clears, allowing the gunners in the fortress of Arc a clear view. Now the League's forces receive devastating flanking fire, in addition to being shot at from the trench. This is too much for Mayenne's forces, and they give up the battle. Mayenne tries to take the crossing a few more times, however Navarre manages to hold on to his positions. Soon reinforcements arrive from England and from the south of France. Now Mayenne has to retreat and Navarre follows. The League's forces regroup in Paris. Meanwhile, Navarre preoccupies himself with small sieges around the capital. He blockades Paris during November, however his forces are insufficient to prevent reinforcements from reaching the city. The siege becomes futile, so Navarre returns to winter quarters. Hostilities resume in the spring of 1590. Navarre approaches the capital and draws the League army to the northwest. The two armies meet on the 14th of March 1590 at the village of Ivry. Navarre is again outnumbered with 11,000 soldiers against the League's 16,000. Both sides arrange their forces in mixed blocks of cavalry and infantry. Again, the main difference is that while the League's cavalry still charges with a lance, Navarre's cavalry are all pistoliers. The first move is made by League cavalry, who charge Navarre's lines. The initial engagement is soon joined by more cavalry squadrons in the centre. Henry of Navarre personally enters the fray, putting his life at risk to achieve victory. When Navarre's reserve charges into the flanks, the League centre begins to unravel.
I wonder who was manufacturing all of these pistols.
Mayenne has to retreat, leaving behind a Navarre remains stationary for 2 weeks, then moves to besiege the capital for a second time. Even though the defenders outnumber the attackers, given the last battles, the League's forces are reluctant to venture out of their defensive positions. But Paris is ill prepared for the 4-month siege. Stockpiles of food soon dwindle, and the defenders begin to eat dogs and horses. By August 1590, 30,000 people, a tenth of the city's population, die of starvation. But they still refuse to surrender because they know that relief is on its way. The Duke of Parma, Philip II's best general in the Low Countries, is already on the march to relieve Paris. As Parma nears the capital, Navarre is forced to detach part of his army to block the Spanish. Parma refuses to engage, and as more and more besiegers are funneled from the siege, a group of Spanish cavalry manages to sneak across the lines to bring supplies to Paris. Navarre realizes that the siege is pointless, therefore he disengages and splits up his army to do minor tasks. By the spring of 1591, Navarre is very short on funds, so he has to disband most of his army. Meanwhile, the League becomes divided. The 16 are increasingly unpopular, as they become too radical even for the hardliners. Therefore, Mayenne launches a coup and deposes the 16, taking over leadership in Paris himself. While this was going on, the League's political position became even more untenable. In May 1590, the Cardinal of Bourbon dies, stripping the League's arguments of all plausibility. To keep up the spirit, new candidates are proposed, such as Mayenne, the young Duke of Guise, or even Philip II. But none of these candidates inspire any enthusiasm, and the League rapidly loses momentum. By autumn 1591, Navarre receives funds from England and the Dutch, and hires a large army of Germans. More reinforcements arrive from England, and Navarre goes on the offensive. In November, he commences the siege of Rouen, in the hope that by capturing it, he can cut off Paris from the sea. The defenders of Rouen endure the siege for months, knowing well that as before, relief is on its way. The Duke of Parma invades once more, and arrives before Rouen in January 1592. Navarre dispatches his cavalry to delay the Spanish, but Parma repulses their attack. A series of maneuvers follow, and as Parma crosses the Seine to conduct a siege, Navarre also crosses in the sea. But Parma quickly builds a pontoon bridge, and just as Navarre is planning his final move, he evacuates his forces across the river. After this, Parma force marches to Paris and reinforces the garrison with Spanish soldiers before heading back to the Netherlands. But by 1593, all parties are tired of war. Hunger, banditry, pestilence, and peasant revolts reach a record level. Both sides are in low spirits, as fighting seems to go on forever with no end in sight. To resolve the impasse, an Estat General is called. Various candidates are proposed for the throne, including the Spanish Infanta. However, by now, most Catholics are distrustful of Spain. They would like law and order to prevail, but they would also require a Catholic king. Consequently, Henry of Navarre is approached again about his religion. After lengthy negotiations, Navarre finally agrees to convert. In July 1593, he becomes a Catholic.
That is so incredible. Like, how obvious is it that this was just, purely a political move, and that like the elites that were really controlling things from behind the scenes, like these people were all related. These people were all cousins and brothers and distant relations with each other. Like they must have all just realized, like, look, the general population wants the country to stay Catholic. This war is just going to drag on forever. We're never going to actually establish the Protestant Reformation that we want right now. We're going to have to just concede, and you're going to become a crypto, basically. You're going to convert to Catholicism, but we'll do things in a more subtle way, more slowly. Seems like to me, I don't see any other explanation. He becomes a cat, like, as if he saw the light and became a genuine convert. It's crazy. How do the average people ever, get fooled by moves like this? It's incredible to me.
By doing this, he removes the final obstacle that prevented him from claiming the throne. Henry IV is crowned in February 1594. In March, he enters Paris nearly unopposed. But convincing all his countrymen and removing the Spanish threat will take time. In 1595, Henry moves against the rebels in Burgundy. They are defeated in spite of Spanish support. Mayenne capitulates after a sizable bribe is paid. But meanwhile, the Spanish seize the northern city of Amiens. Now, Henry marches to the north and ousts the Spanish by 1597. Peace with Spain is achieved in 1598. After some more campaigns and more bribes, the last remnants of the Catholic League are eliminated in the same year. In an attempt to achieve a lasting peace, the now Catholic Henry proposes a religious compromise to his Protestant comrades. The Edict of Nantes is proclaimed on April 30th, 15...
What do you guys think about this physiognomy here? Frenchman or crypto? What do you guys think? Let's see if there's other pictures. Oof, that one looks kind of crypto to me. That nose looks suspicious right there. What the fuck? And that's supposed to be symbolic of him vanquishing the Catholic League. Look at the monument that they put back there. That's very Masonic. It's a two-headed eagle. Oh God, look at that's an even bigger nose on that one. God damn. Physiognomy remains undefeated. Was this his coat of arms? 2 Red Bulls? Interesting. So he began as a Huguenot and ended as the king, but as a quote-unquote Catholic convert. I'm not buying it, fellas. He's a crypto. Typical.
1898. The treaty allows free worship everywhere where Protestantism already exists. The Huguenots receive scores of security towns, they can hold offices, and their priests and soldiers are to be paid by the state. On the other hand, the Catholic Church's property has to be restored, and Huguenots too will have to pay the tithe, as well as their other taxes. Also, they will not be allowed to form any political associations. The peace is...
Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. No political associations, guys. Keep it on the down low. Okay, guys, just be secretive about it. That's basically what he was saying.
First treated with skepticism by the population. Radicals on both sides are unsatisfied, but war is averted during Henry IV's reign. Military battles are moved to the courts of law. However, in this seeming peace, resistance is fermenting under the surface. Henry IV is assassinated by a radical Catholic in 1610. Shortly after, a religious war breaks out. After a hard-fought war that culminates with the siege of La Rochelle, the Protestants lose to their king. Louis XIV takes away all their privileges and nullifies the Edict of Nantes. Most Huguenots either convert or flee abroad.
Oh, Louis XIV. So you mean 13th? How did that succession go? His son also married a Medici. So this is Henry IV's son, Louis XIII, ruled for like 33 years. Okay, interesting numerology there. He was married to a Medici, and then his son, the 14th, the Sun King, ruled for 72 years. And he allegedly was so Catholic that he kicked out all the Protestants. I don't know. He abolished the rights of the Huguenots. When his grandpa was a Huguenot and his mom was a Medici. I don't know. I'm not sure what to make of that, but it seems like there were definitely ulterior motives. Or no, his mom was Anne of Austria, so even though his dad, or no, I'm sorry, his grandma was the Medici. His mom was Anne of Austria. And where did she come from? Her mom was Margaret of Austria. Also a Catholic, so I don't know, maybe maybe the pendulum of power did swing back to the Catholic side at this point. Because basically Habsburgs ended up taking over. Interesting. Very interesting.
Full religious toleration will only be achieved after the French Revolution. Looking at what the war achieved, we are presented with a bleak picture. By the time of Francis I and Henry II, France was on its way to becoming the strongest European state. But great nobles resented the monarchy's power and joined their cause with religion to usurp this power for themselves. Thus weakened, France is paralysed for half a century. This gives Spain and the Habsburgs unparalleled primacy. Both the Huguenots and France itself come out on the losing side. However, the war does offer Protestants an indispensable break, and this means that more religious wars are to come.
So it seems like maybe what was happening is France was just becoming too powerful for the international order to tolerate, and they had to knock them down a peg. It seems like the hegemon of the system was meant to be Britain. That's what came out of this, was Britain. You know, it says Spain and the Habsburgs were on top, but really in the centuries that followed, Britain was the one that established the world empire, and they were Protestant. So this was internationally orchestrated to knock France down a peg at that time. But that it was basically overall part of this agenda of reforming the European system as a whole and supporting the Protestant powers against the Catholic powers, which, you know, I've already given you my characterization of these two conflicting powers in European society. So that ends the French Wars of Religion. I think I learned a lot. It's an interesting moment in history. There's so many different families to investigate here. So many different little interesting connections and conflicts, and you know, like I said at the beginning, this is a crucial moment or a crucial period of European history where Protestantism was initiating this transformation of European society away from the sort of agrarian land-based power of the old aristocracy to the new urban mercantile elite. And France seemed to represent a stronghold. Sorry, my eye is killing me. Seemed to represent a stronghold of the old aristocratic power, and that they weren't going along with the program the way that they were supposed to. And this war seemed to be meant to break their power. So I think that's all I've got for tonight. It's getting pretty late. I've got work in the morning. And thank you all for coming on the chat and hanging out with me tonight. And I'll be doing another live stream soon. I think this is it for the Protestant Reformation at this moment. I'm not sure what topics I'll get into in the next stream. There is, of course, the viral and topical issues that I can explore on Twitter. One of which maybe I'll talk about this next time is Cocomelon, because there's been a lot of talk about Cocomelon lately. I kind of agree with this post. It's a dramatic way of putting it, but psychofauna devouring children. Cocomelon has been extremely destructive to the younger generation these days, and my wife and I have greatly restricted this kind of content for our children. So maybe I could talk about that, or any number of interesting topics from Twitter. I've been bookmarking every clip that I've seen on my timeline that discusses the Holocaust. So, maybe I'll play like a series of these clips and talk about them. Then, of course, there's Sandy Hook, which I don't think I can discuss on YouTube, but maybe I'll do like a Twitter space or something like that about Sandy Hook. A lot of stuff going on with the Trump administration. It's a mixed bag. Some things I'm really hopeful about. Other things, obviously, don't look very good. So there's a lot to talk. There's always a lot to talk about. But like I said, I think we'll give the Protestant Reformation a break, and move on to something else. So thank you all for showing up. Thank you all for watching. And hope to see you again soon. Have a good night.